the renal system. And as I'm erasing here, let's make a little segue, all right? The digestive system, and in particular the liver, is responsible for maintaining nutritional homeostasis, right? It's giving you food during the time you're eating a meal, making sure you only get as much as you need and save some for later. And then later on, when you haven't eaten a meal, guess what? Your liver is going to start to release that food, right? That stored glycogen and so forth to make sure the tissues get nourished. So the liver is an organ that's responsible for nutritional homeostasis, all right? We're about to start talking about the renal system, where the central character there is the kidney, and its job is non-nutritional homeostasis. That is, maintaining the quality of the body fluids, not in terms of the amount of food that's there, but rather in terms of the non-nutritional components, all right? And to help you to understand that, we're going to look very quickly at the main functions of the liver, which I've subdivided into primary functions and secondary functions. And the primary functions are the ones that obviously are the ones we want to be thinking about most, all right? To do that, let's start with a cell, all right? Just to review here, something very basic, but we can understand the role of the liver. Sorry, I knew I was going to do that. We can understand the role of the kidney, all right, by looking at one cell in the body. This is any cell, any and every cell, all right? And that is to recognize that inside this cell, you've got enzymes of all sorts, right? You've got nutrients, and you've got vitamins, and you've got minerals, and you've got various ions, all right? And as you start to paint this picture, you start to see that the cell is filled with a lot of solutes, dissolved molecules, all right? And anytime you have a closed space, a cell, filled with solutes, you have to worry about osmotic problems. Because if you just have water out here, if the blood plasma, if the fluid in between your cells is just water, all right, this is the extracellular fluid versus the intracellular fluid. If this is just water, what's water going to do? Everybody's good with that? Water's going to go into the cell by what process? By osmosis. Does everybody understand that idea? You've got to understand that to understand the kidney. All right, so water's going to move in, all right, and the cell is going to swell and it'll destroy the cell, all right? This is a big problem for animals. Plants don't have this problem because they surround their cells with a rigid cell wall that prevents it from being able to burst, all right? But for animals, you can't have a rigid cell wall because you like to move around, right? And so you need your cells to be pliable, all right? And so how do you compensate or correct or regulate so that this doesn't happen? And what you do is you put a bunch of salts out here. You put a bunch of sodium ions and chloride ions out here, all right? So that the total number of sodium and chloride ions and other stuff, including plasma proteins and the sugars that are in your blood plasma and the other things that are there, the total number of solutes here is 300 milliosmolar. All right, you don't have to worry about the units, but let's just focus on the number. All right, and that 300 is exactly balanced by the total number of all these solutes inside the cell, which is going to be 300. All right, so that because the total number of solutes, all right, you guys have, most of you have taken chemistry. Yes, you've taken chemistry, and so you learned about molarity as a way to measure concentration? Yes? All right. Osmolarity is simply the sum of all the molarities of everything that's there. All right? It's just the sum total of all the molarities. All right? So it tells you how many particles are inside the cell or outside the cell. And these two need to be kept in balance, right? Well, the two primary extracellular solutes are sodium and chloride ions, all right? And the principal intracellular solute, because I can't just sort of say, well, I've got a little less sodium out here, so let's get rid of some of these enzymes. No, I need these enzymes, right? So I've got to have an ion in here that I can alter, increase or decrease as these fluctuate out here, all right? And that ion inside is potassium, all right? So these are the ions, especially sodium and potassium ions, because they have the same charge. These are the ions that you use to maintain osmotic equilibrium. All right? And that's what you want. Osmotic equilibrium means water doesn't move in or water doesn't move out. Everything is balanced. All right? And that's what you want. You want a state of osmotic equilibrium. You're going to achieve it by maintaining potassium inside and sodium outside. And there's about 35 times more potassium inside the cell, and there's about 35 times more potassium inside than there is outside. All right? And there's about 10 times more sodium outside than there is inside. All right, the cell. And I can regulate these. All right? And that's how I'm going to maintain osmotic balance, osmotic equilibrium. Okay, we're good? Everybody's good? All right, next step. So you decide to drink a lot of water. You decided, I think I'm just going to chug-a-lug this whole thing, all right? What have you just done to the concentration of solutes in the extracellular fluid? You've diluted it. And what's water going to do? Water's going to move into the cell because there's less solute here than there is in here. Water's going to move in. Everybody's good with that? All right. You don't want that to happen. So you want to get rid of that excess water. Kidney. All right? You didn't bring water. You brought a big bag of those kettle chips, those potato chips that are just the salty heaven, right? All right, and you ate the whole bag, okay? You've just taken on a big load of salt. All right? What's going to happen to your cell? You've just put a bunch of sodium chloride in the extracellular fluid compartment. Water's going to leave the cell. Cells are going to shrink. All right? So, we've just described the two functions of the kidney, the two most important functions. To regulate body fluid volume, which means the amount of water. Number one. Number two, to regulate the ion concentration of the body fluids, because sometimes you take on salt, you've just eaten a bunch of potato chips. Other times you were out for a jog and you did a lot of sweating and you lost a lot of salt from your extracellular compartment, right? And so you need to correct for that, okay? All right, so we have to have a system then that's going to regulate body fluid volume so that we don't change these numbers. We stay 300 in and 300 out. And a system for regulating ion concentration of the body fluids because, again, if you change the ion concentrations, it will also cause the cell to swell or shrink, all right, because those will then precipitate movements of water. Okay, are we good? All right, fantastic. All right, so those are the two principal functions. One other is simply that as long as you have an organ that's able to get rid of excess water and get rid of excess salt, it becomes a nice avenue to get rid of cellular wastes, all right, most importantly, nitrogenous waste. Nitrogen wastes are wastes that are produced in the course of metabolizing protein, all right? And the big product there is ammonia, and ammonia is extremely toxic to cells, all right? And so you have, among other things, your liver is able to convert that ammonia into something a little less toxic called urea, all right? And that urea is excreted, good word, right? Excreted, we just learned it, excreted by the kidneys as well. All right? The urea is excreted by the kidneys. And so we are doing osmoregulation and we're also removing cellular waste because as long as you're processing the body fluids for salts and water balance, you might as well get rid of all those other things that don't belong in there, mainly the urea. Okay? All right? So that's it. Now, secondary functions really quick. Remember when I asked you to think back to the last time you vomited? All right. And what did we say? You lost some acid, and so how did you compensate for that? You started breathing slowly. All right, here's the dynamic here. If some metabolic event, like vomiting, all right, causes a change in the body's acid-base balance, in the body's pH, your lungs will compensate for that. Okay? But if your lungs create a disturbance in the acid-base balance, then your kidneys will compensate for that. All right? So we have two events then. We have what we call metabolic imbalance, which has to do with the kidneys, all right, or any other part of the system that's not working. And we have respiratory imbalance, all right? And likewise, we have the kidneys being able to correct, or the respiratory system, as you saw in the vomiting example, being able to correct, all right? And so the bottom line is, if the cause of pH imbalance is metabolic, then the kidneys do the fixing, or the lungs do the fixing. Darn it. All right, then the lungs do the fixing. All right, and if the lungs are the problem, then the kidneys do the fixing. All right, so if it's a respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, then it's a metabolic compensation by the kidneys. All right, and if it's a metabolic acidosis or alkalosis, like the vomiting example, then it's a respiratory compensation. All right? That's how it works. Okay? So your kidneys are able then to regulate pH when something happens with your lungs. All right? What kind of thing can happen with your lungs? Go to high altitude. All right? And you go to high altitude and you vent your CO2 a lot faster. And if you vent your CO2 a lot faster, what happens to your pH? Can you sort that one? Up or down? If you get rid of CO2 because you're at high altitude, lower partial pressure, you get rid of more CO2, it means there's less CO2 in your system, which means it's going to be less acidic. All right? And so you have respiratory alkalosis there. The body has become alkaline. All right? And what's your kidney going to do? It's going to try to hold on to hydrogen ions, and it's going to try to dump bicarbonate ions. And you don't have to know this physiology, but you get the idea? Right? You get the general idea? So the kidney is going to be able to compensate when the lungs don't do something. If somebody has chronic pulmonary obstructive disease, COPD, right? They've had a blow to the brain stem. Their breathing is chronically slow. All right? If their breathing is chronically slow, it's a respiratory problem. What's going to happen to their pH? It's going to be more acidic. They're holding on to CO2, right? It's going to be more acidic. Guess what the kidney's going to be doing? It's going to be dumping acid into the urine, right, to compensate. Get it? All right. Now, finally, if I take on a lot of salt, I ate that big bag of potato chips, all right, what's water going to do? Water is going to leave the cell. And when water leaves the cell, it goes into the extracellular compartment, which includes your vascular system. So what happens to your blood pressure? It goes up. You know that. If you eat a lot of salt, what happens to your blood pressure? It can go up unless your kidneys are able to do the regulating. All right? So your kidneys, as a secondary function, are also going to be able to affect changes in blood pressure. And finally, because the kidney is an organ that receives such a huge share of the blood coming from the heart, I've told you before, 20%, a fifth of the blood pumped from the heart going out to the body, a fifth goes to your kidneys. What does that tell you about how important they are? Super important, all right? And they become then a super duper checkpoint for testing, do I have enough red blood cells? Whole different function. But if you're sending 25% of your blood or 20% of your blood to an organ, that'd be a good place to be checking, do I have enough, right? Okay? Red blood cells. And so this organ is responsible for producing the hormone erythropoietin, all right, which stimulates red blood cell production, all right? And it then ultimately is responsible for controlling the amount of red blood cells in your blood plasma, okay? All right, gross anatomy here, you guys. Let's see what we can do here. All right? We're going to come back and talk about these primary functions again next time as we look at the functional unit of the kidney. All right. For right now, let's get a picture of the gross anatomy. And here you can see the kidney on the right side. Here's your pair of kidneys, all right, receiving blood supply through the renal arteries, right? Big, huge arteries carrying, as I say, a fifth of the cardiac output, all right? The kidneys drain through the renal veins, and those go into the vena cava. So there's your general blood supply, all right? The kidneys themselves sit behind the peritoneum, all right? They are retroperitoneal, and we'll look at how they're secured in place in just a moment. And then from the kidneys, as they process the blood, as they monitor the concentration of ions, the amount of water in the body fluids, they do so by generating a filtrate of the blood plasma. It's saying they're going to take the blood and they're going to filter the water through this system with all the things that's dissolved in the water, all right? And they're going to add and remove things to it and modify it, put stuff back into the body, but whatever you don't need, too much water, too much salt, goes into your urine, all right? So the organ is going to produce urine. So what I was leading up to is, I never want you to say the purpose of the kidney is to produce urine, all right? That's like saying the purpose of your car is to make exhaust, all right? It's like saying the purpose of the digestive tract is to make feces, all right? That would be wrong, wouldn't it? All right, that'd be missing the whole point, all right? So urine is a byproduct of this very important set of functions that are going on, all right? And when that urine is produced, it's delivered into a pair of tubules that run from the kidneys down to the bladder, all right? Those are called the ureters, all right? This pair of tubes that you see here. And they enter into the posterior surface of the bladder, all right? And then the urinary bladder then is a storage vessel, right, for urine. And then, of course, the urethra then becomes the exit point, all right, for draining or emptying the bladder, okay? And we'll talk about the urinary tract next time or whenever we get to it, all right? It'll be the last thing we talk about. I want to go back up to the kidneys and begin to at least get us into the organ a little bit, okay? All right. So here's a cross-section through the trunk of the body down around the bottom of your thoracic or your upper lumbar vertebrae. All right, and here you go. This particular one is the bottom of that's the body of L2. So that's your second lumbar vertebra right here, cut in cross-section. All right, and there you see the two kidneys. All right, and they are retroperitoneal. So let me first define the peritoneum. Here it is. That's the parietal peritoneum, right? Coming around, and look what it does. It sits in front of, it doesn't invest them, does it? It just sits in front. So the kidneys, you see them now as retroperitoneal, all right? The kidneys themselves are covered with a dense irregular connective tissue capsule, all right? Just a fibrous capsule, a covering over the organ. And then there's a layer of fat, which you see right along the surface. That's called the perinephric fat, okay? It insulates, it cushions, it anchors, all right? And then there's a little layer of renal fascia, all right? A little layer of renal fascia, which you see right there in between these two layers of fat. And then there's a second layer of fat, the perinephric fat, which sits between the renal fascia and the peritoneum, all right? So it's a detailed bit of anatomy that I don't care that much about, frankly. All right, but there it is. The important thing is that your kidneys are held in place in probably the least secure manner of any other vital organ. They're just sitting against the dorsal body wall, retroperitoneal, with a nice cushion of fat around them, all right? And that's what holds them in place, which I guess is when people, do things like racing motorcycles over long stretches of desert or riding in those very fast speedboats over bumpy water. What do? They wear a kidney belt, right? They wear something to sort of compress and sort of keep things from, because those kidneys are just, it's a robust organ, right? It's a stout organ, and it's bouncing around. So they're just trying to sort of stabilize things a little bit. All right. So when we cut the organ in cross-section, and let's do this slide, and we'll stop at the end of this slide, all right? When we cut the organ in cross-section, or as you have a coronal section here, all right, we can define the following areas, all right? This outer region here, just inside the capsule, is called the cortex, all right? Each of these areas that I'm defining has particular significance. So learn these landmark areas, all right? This outer portion here, the cortex, all right? The dividing line here that I'm tracing separates the cortex from the more inner component, the medulla, all right? And the medulla is subdivided in an interesting way, all right? You have these pyramid-shaped areas, all right, which are called renal pyramids, all right? And then you have a region in between the renal pyramids called the renal columns. The renal columns, for our discussion, aren't where the action is, all right? They're the place where the boring stuff happens, as in blood vessels trying to get from the entry point, the hilum of the organ, out to the cortex, traverse through the renal columns, as do nerves, as do lymphatics, all right? So all the sort of transiting stuff that gets all the equipment we need, all right, out to the cortex travels in the renal columns, all right? The functional stuff that has to do with what the organ is about, what we've just described, all right, is found in the cortex and in these renal pyramids, all right? And together, each renal pyramid, its adjacent renal columns, and the cortex that overlies that, those components together make up a lobe of the kidney. All right? It's not really clearly defined in terms of you don't see it as a discrete thing like you saw the lobes of the lung or the lobes of the liver even. All right? But as a region, as a defined region, all right, we can say that a liver or a kidney lobe is the renal pyramid, the overlying cortex, and the adjacent renal columns. All right? Urine, or I should say, as the filtrate of the blood plasma is processed to form the urine drains down and emerges through a little papilla here. Papilla, you know, is what? It's a little out-pocketing, right? And so you have at the tip of each renal pyramid, you have a renal papilla which drains into a space here. And this space is like a funnel that has been subdivided into many smaller funnels. All right? And each funnel comes up to meet the renal papilla of each renal pyramid. All right? And that funnel is called a minor calyx, which converges into a major calyx, which converges into the larger opening here, the renal pelvis, which drains into the ureter. All right? So by the time something reaches this space here, it's urine. Okay? That's when it's urine. It isn't urine at any time before that. Before that, it's called filtrate. All right? Because we're still adding things and taking things away from it. All right? We're not ready to let it go yet. All right? But once it emerges into the minor calyx, it is now urine. And that urine from the minor calyx goes to the major calyx, into the renal pelvis, and from there into the ureter. All right? There are, as it says here, 8 to 15 renal pyramids, which is the same as saying there are 8 to 15 lobes per kidney. All right? And what we're going to do next time is we're going to climb inside of one of these lobes, and we're going to dissect out a tiny tubule, right, called the nephron, or the kidney tubule. And we're going to look at that. Now, you have about 2.5 million kidney tubules total in your two kidneys, all right? About 2.5 million kidney tubules.